Amen. Welcome, everyone. It's the first presentation of our camp meeting, yesterday being the Sabbath day, we visited the Bonnyrigg Fellowship in Sydney, and Elder Parminder and myself presented there at Bonnyrigg. So I want to actually briefly pull a couple of concepts from yesterday's presentation, and I know many of you weren't there, but for many of you it was familiar concepts that we reviewed there. Yesterday we reviewed the line of the 144,000, and we looked at its three fractals. So if this was the line of the 144,000, we identified that it had 5 primary waymarks: 1989, 9/11, Sunday law, close of probation, Daniel 12:1, and the second advent. That being the line of the 144,000, Sunday law marking midway, or midnight. From this, we then reviewed our 3 fractal lines. So we understood that God called out a people in 3 steps. We didn't go through the naming of the priests, Levites, and Nethinims. We simplified and just called them the first, the second, and the third. The first group, called out in 1989, also having 5 primary waymarks. We understand this as the line of the priests: 1989 to 9/11, 2014 marking the Sunday law, 2019 marking the close of probation, 2021 marking Panium. Then we saw that there's another 2 groups called out. The second group comprised of the Levites. (2019) marking their Sunday law, Panium marking their close of probation, Daniel 11:41 their second advent. A third group. This is the third group, and it's the Nethinims. Their time of the end is 2014. 2019. Panium marks their Sunday law, Daniel 11:41, their close of probation, Daniel 12:1, their second advent. So you have these 3 groups. First, the priests are harvested. Then they're prepared to harvest the Levites, and then prepared to harvest the Nethinims. So harvest after harvest after harvest. And then following the harvest of the third group, you have the harvest of the group known as the 144,000. So this was our basic structure, and we just reviewed it yesterday. We also spoke of that repeating pattern. To see that repeating pattern most clearly it's good to remind ourselves of the model of agriculture. 5 waymarks, just like a hand, 5 fingers, 4 spaces, or 4 dispensations. And Elder Parminder spoke of dispensations yesterday. Dispensation 1, ploughing. Dispensation 2, early rain. 3, latter rain. 4, harvest. So you know that these periods of time can be spoken of as a dispensation, and the work being done to the field, when you consider the model of agriculture, is different from one dispensation to another. In one dispensation, it's a work of ploughing. In another dispensation, it's the work of the early rain. In another, the latter rain, and in the last, the harvest. So that work is changing from dispensation to dispensation. You could say the work of ploughing is dispensational. And what does that work of ploughing? What ploughed the priests between 1989 and 9/11? It was a message. It was a message that opened up in 1989 that was studied until you can identify an increase of knowledge in 1991, and then a formalisation in 1996. So there is this message that's doing a work from 1989 to 9/11, and that message does the work of ploughing the field. So if I was to take out the ploughing and say, what did that look like in reality? We would identify that what we were observing was the work of a message. And that message fulfilled a particular type of job function for the field. In this parable, it ploughed it. If a message did this ploughing work, what's the early rain? It must be a message. A message does the work of the early rain. First, a message ploughs the field, then the seed is sown, and then it's a message that's going to water that seed. And we identify that in every one of these dispensations, if there is a work done, then it must be being done by a message. Therefore, that message must enter into history, it must arrive, someone must begin to understand it, then they must formalise it by teaching it, and then those who are recipients of that message must be tested upon it. To repeat myself, each one of these dispensations is a work being done to that field. That field is first ploughed, then it receives the early rain, then the latter rain, and then it is harvested. It is a message that did that work in the ploughing. And it's a message that has symbolically been our early rain, a message that was the latter rain, and a message that was the harvest. It's a specific message to do a specific type of work. So that message must arrive. The message arrived in 1989. Someone had to begin to study it and understand it, 1991, and then formalised it in 1996. And once they had formalised it, those who are meant to be the recipients of that message are tested upon it. 9/11. At 9/11, a message is unsealed. Someone has to begin to study it and understand it. This message is going to fulfill the job function of the early rain for God's people. It's a separate subject, linked but separate to what opened up in the first dispensation. This was the 2520. Someone had to begin to study it and understand it, and in 2009, Elder Parminder did just that. And the 2520 revealed was presented and taped in Arkansas. But the 2520 had not finished opening up. In 2012, the 2520 is finally identified as being, whether those words were used or not, the key that unlocks time, and time entered into the movement. A prediction of 2014. So first of all, a message is unsealed, then it begins to be studied by an individual, they have an increase of knowledge upon it, they formalize it, and once they have formalized it, those who are meant to be recipients of that message are tested upon it. I just do that so we can see in a larger fashion what each one of these 4 dispensations within a reform line expands into. In each history, a message testing. So this is what we looked at yesterday, and then we went to the line of Christ. And what did we understand about the line of Christ? This is the history of the end of modern Israel. What is the line of Christ? It's the end of ancient Israel. If this is the end of modern Israel, then shouldn't we expect that the end of ancient Israel is going to follow that same pattern? So we looked at that history, we looked at the end of ancient Israel, and we identified that it follows this same pattern. You have a time of the end, 4 BC, the birth of Christ. First of all, you have an increase of knowledge, the work of John the Baptist. But in the history of John the Baptist and Christ, they're preparing the disciples. Why is Jesus preparing the disciples? He's training them up because he's going to send them back to the church. He sends them back to the church at Pentecost. Where did we place the Sunday law?
Pentecost.
Sunday law. Who do they go to? Who's their third group? The third group is the Gentiles. And when do they go to the Gentiles? 34 AD. The Nethinims are the world. At Sunday law, we go to the world. And begin to give the loud cry of the third angel. At Sunday law, we go to the third group, which is the world. At 34 AD, they went to the third group, which was the Gentiles. They did that after the stoning of Stephen, and this marked the end of the 490-year time prophecy, or the 70 weeks. And the quote that we read yesterday, the point of it was in identifying that at the end of the 490-year time prophecy, the Jewish nation closed their probation. And we're going to come back to this point later in this evening's study, that at this waymark, at Sunday law, the Jewish nation closed their probation as an institution. So where are we today? If I was to take the line of the priests, we're within this third dispensation, the outpouring of the latter rain. And where are we in this dispensation? We've been through 2014, the Sunday law. There's been an increase of knowledge, 2016. It was formalised in 2018, October. All that takes us to 2019, a shut door. This is our dispensation, and it's leading us to our close of probation. And where are we on that line? What day is it today? It's the third. How many days have we got left?
6.
It's next We are right up against our close of probation. We are here. This camp meeting runs until our close of probation. We are right at the door. I want you to go to early writings. Go to the chapter titles if you can. If you were to open up early writings, go into spiritual gifts. Go into spiritual gifts and scan down the chapter titles. We're not going to go through them. I want you to go down until you see the sins of Babylon. We've placed the sins of Babylon as Sunday law. That's been done throughout the last few months. The sins of Babylon, the Sunday law. What's the next chapter? The loud cry, and then the third message closed. So in the context of spiritual gifts, where do we currently stand? For the line of the priests, and all of us here should be priests, where are we in spiritual gifts? We're between the loud cry and the third message closed. In fact, we're closer than ever to the closing of that third message. So I would like you to open that chapter. We're going to read the first paragraph. Early Writings 279.1. The purpose of these reform lines are so we can locate ourselves in history. So we've gone to spiritual gifts, we're taking it to our reform line, and we're locating ourselves in history. I want us to read this first paragraph. Early Writings 279.1. I was pointed down to the time when the third angel's message was closing. The power of God had rested upon his people. They had accomplished their work and were prepared for the trying hour before them. They had received the latter rain, or refreshing from the presence of the Lord, and the living testimony had been revived. The last great warning had sounded everywhere, and it had stirred up and enraged the inhabitants of the earth who would not receive the message. The third message closed. That's the chapter. The third message closed is right here. She's located this experience on the reform line for us. She says she's pointed down to the time when the third angel's message was closing. The power of God had rested upon his people. They had accomplished their work and were prepared for the trying hour before them. And then she's going to review the past experience they had just had. They had received the latter rain, or refreshing from the presence of the Lord, and the living testimony had been revived. The last great warning had sounded everywhere. What's the title of the last great warning? It's the loud cry, or the midnight cry, which is the chapter before. The last great warning, or the loud cry that she's just discussed, had sounded everywhere. And what has that cry done? It had stirred up and enraged the inhabitants of the earth who would not receive the message. In this chapter, what is she discussing? She's discussing this history here. There's a message that's gone to the Nethinims. It's gone to the world, beginning at Sunday law, it has swelled to the loud cry, the final warning. And what has it done? It has stirred up and enraged the inhabitants of the earth who would not receive the message. So in this history, there's a group of people who are supposed to receive the message. If you receive it, you're prepared for the time of trouble. If you have not received it, What condition are you in? It has stirred up and enraged the inhabitants of the earth who would not receive the message. So in this history, in the history of the Nethinims, when the loud cry is given to them, produces two classes of people. It produces a class of people who are prepared for the time of trouble, and for those who will not accept this message, who are supposed to accept it, but will not accept it, it stirs up and enrages them. Go to the line of the priests. Where are we? We're here. We're at the midnight cry. A message opened up at our Sunday law. It has grown to the increase of knowledge of 2016. We come to the midnight cry of October 2018. And then between the midnight cry, or in spiritual gifts you'll call it the loud cry, and the closing of the third angel's message, that shut door, this midnight cry message is going to create two classes of people. Where in the line of the priest do you expect to see those two classes of people? In the history of the Nethinims, it's those who are meant to receive the message that are stirred up and angered. In the line of the priest, who's meant to receive this midnight cry message? Is it the wider church that's stirred up and enraged? The wider church was not tested by this midnight cry message. The Nethinims or the world were not tested by this midnight cry message. This midnight cry message was designed for those who were supposed to call themselves priests. And for those that came into this movement, that came into this message through all this history, they come to this point in time, and it's for them that this midnight cry message was sounded. And it's created two classes of people. For those who refuse to receive the midnight cry message, it has stirred up and enraged them. So we've gone to spiritual gifts. We've seen the sequence of events as she lays them out. We see the loud cry and then the closing of the third angel's message. And we've zoned in on what she says that loud cry does. That great warning. The great warning creates two classes of people. It creates two classes among those who are designed to receive it. In this history of the loud cry, when the gospel goes to the Nethinims, the two classes, the class that is meant to receive it is the world. It's going to divide them. In the line of the priests, the two classes were the priesthood. And it's within the priesthood that you have two classes developed. Those who are prepared for the time of trouble and those who are stirred up and enraged. There are those within this movement who are under the impression that the current division that we find within this movement, the shaking that we have experienced, is some type of personal quarrel within our leadership. Somehow one of us wasn't nice, and we have this moral argument going back and forth where if we sat down, talked out our differences, we would be able to reconcile. The problem with that logic is that they do not see the prophetic significance of what has just occurred, the fulfillment of prophecy of what has just occurred. Can the midnight cry message come and not divide two classes? It is the effect of the midnight cry message. And the shaking that we see in our movement is a rejection of the midnight cry. The last great warning sounded. It began to sound October last year. The midnight cry was given. It stirred up and enraged all those who would not receive the message. And we find now that shaking. So my purpose in these two presentations, our first two presentations together, is to give some type of review a review of this message, going from where it began and what we learnt from it. And it'll be a broad overview in about 2 presentations of the development of the message. So I want to repeat the point made in the introduction this morning. We've located where we are on a reform line. We know the significance of this camp meeting. And I believe providence that has enabled us to all come together at this crucial point in time to meet and mingle and know each other. And while I believe and hope it'll be a blessed and pleasant experience, I again want to encourage you to come to us with your questions, with your point of view, and to not go through this camp meeting at this crucial point in history, holding your questions in your chest and not expressing and talking and discussing with us. Light comes out of discussion, and we do want this to be interactive. After presentations, in meal times, to have that chance of discussion. So the first 2 presentations I want to do at this camp meeting are a review of the Midnight Cry message, where it began, and step by step how it developed and where it took us over the last 3 years, particularly. We identified that repeating pattern, that within one reform line, you have 5 key waymarks and 4 dispensations. That in each dispensation is a message designed to do a specific work. Someone is going to have an increase of knowledge on that message, formalize it, and the people will be tested upon it. We have gone in previous presentations through the history of 9/11 to 2014 and this dispensation and looked at the 25-20. If we have time at this camp meeting, we'll do that again. But our main focus in these couple of presentations is this dispensation, the one we're in now, of 14 to 19. So we know that in 2014, a message was unsealed there's going to be an increase of knowledge and a formalization, and then a test. We know that these 2 waymarks between 2014 and 2019 are 2016 and 2018, and we can learn a lot from those dates, from the external, from the happenings internal. Many presentations have been done on the events of 2016 and 2018. But I want to focus in these presentations on what developed internally within our message. In late 2016, around October, November, I was watching a presentation by someone who has since left the movement. This was someone at Arkansas at the School of the Prophets who was at that point in time one of their teachers. And he, at that point in time, was already beginning to fight against the movement, and soon afterwards he left the movement. But in those presentations, I suppose as part of his attempt to be rebellious against the leadership, he began to say that we needed to study for ourselves. We couldn't follow any type of leadership. We had to study and prove things for ourselves. And while that sounds good, the purpose behind him making that point was that he wanted people to really turn against the movement leadership. He wanted to undermine any movement authority. That was his purpose. At that point in time, I didn't know his purpose. But as characteristic of those who leave the movement, even the ones who've left in the 3 months prior to now, nothing he said made logical sense. And I knew it didn't make logical sense, so I soon after stopped listening to his videos. But that one point that he did make, that we should study for ourselves, stayed in my mind. And that night I looked at eSword, and I wasn't sure how to study for myself. So I went to the search engine and I typed in midnight, because if you've been watching these presentations over the last, really over a few years now, you'll understand that midnight has become a significant symbol in this movement. Midnight, the symbol of July 21 from the parable of the 10 virgins, becomes a symbol that you line up with the waymark also known as Sunday law. So I typed in midnight and wanted to know where these symbols would take me, and they took me to Acts 27. This was in 2016, the later months around October and November. It took me to Acts 27:27. I will read that, Acts 27:27. But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country. So I searched for midnight, came to Acts 27:27, and noted the word midnight. In reading that sentence, other symbols start to become apparent to you. Another symbol you might identify as the 14th night. Now, we teach in this movement that midnight is July 21st in Millerite history. But midnight is also associated with the midnight cry, which also exists at midnight, lining up with the Exeter camp meeting. And Exeter, that camp meeting, Samuel Snow arrives on the 14th night. So you start to see that midnight is not the only symbol that you find presented in these verses. Growing up in the church, I had one key problem with the sermons that I heard. They were very repetitive. If you were to go to an Adventist church and ask the preacher to present on Acts 27, you'll get a nice story. You'll get a moral lesson about what it is like to be in a storm and trust in God, because God will take care of you and He won't let you get hurt because He has a purpose for your life. That's the type of sermon you're going to hear in a conference church from Acts 27. The problem that we should all have with that type of sermon is, why does it then take chapter after chapter to explain this history, the background, and then the voyage? That could all be said in about 1/20th of the verses, if that's the moral lesson. When you grow up in a church, not just Adventism, when you grow up in a Christianity that tries to tell you God loves you, when tries to tell you that you're worth something, and you go to the verses, and instead of taking a few verses to say, I love you, you're worth something, even a personal message, why does God think we need to know that that was the 14th night? Why does it even matter what night it was? Why does it matter if they were on that ship for 3 months before they were shipwrecked? Or 2 weeks? It makes absolutely no difference to your life or the moral lesson. Why does it make any difference that it's at midnight compared to 2 a.m.? These are the questions that started making me very dissatisfied with the presentations I heard from just a normal conference sermon. Not just dissatisfied in their content, but also questioning their content. Questioning when they say God loves you, and then opening the Bible and finding so many words that seemed meaningless to my experience. If you were to go to Acts 27:37, and we were all in the ship, 276 souls, what difference does that make to your life? How does that change the moral lesson? How does that give you any more faith that God will put you on a ship like Paul and take care of you and protect you and bring you to your destination? It makes no difference. And the problem is that when you go through the Bible, unless you start looking at it through prophetic glasses, which are the same as parable glasses, 99% of it is irrelevant. You have to see it through a parable set of glasses to make relevant these facts. So in the later months of 2016, when I turned to Acts 27, these symbols started to come out, and I started to understand why this movement is so significant and why our methodology is so significant. What it can offer us that nowhere else in earth, nothing else on earth can offer us. It can give us meaning. And I began to study this chapter. And it isn't my purpose to go through Acts 27, but I want us to step through each step of the development of the Midnight Cry message. Acts 27 is just the first step. So if we can remind ourselves, it all began at the increase of knowledge. The external events were all there. The election of Donald Trump, the November 9 election. We can talk about the external, we're focusing on the internal. And in those later months, at the increase of knowledge waymark, Acts 27 opened up. And we see Acts 27 as a journey of two ships, the ship of Adramyttium and the ship of Alexandria. There are two ships. The ship of Adramyttium and the ship of Alexandria. Just to give us a brief revision of these lines. The ship of Adramyttium, beginning in verse 1. Verses 1 to 5 is that first ship. This is all verses 1 to 5. And the ship of Adramyttium takes us from Caesarea, which means severed, all the way to Myra and Lycia, which is the waymark of Sunday law. So it takes us from the severing, which we identified as 1989, all the way to Sunday law. It stepped us through 1989, through 9/11, the tarrying time, through the midnight cry of Panium, and through to Sunday law, where that ship comes to its end. And what was the theme of that journey? It gives it to us in Caesarea, the message of Paul going to two men, Felix and Agrippa. So on this board, I want us to work our way through step by step, through each of the development of this message. On this board, I want us to be reminded of the understanding that brought. the truth that opened up, the light that Acts 27 opened up, was it showed us the first ship from 1989 to Sunday Law, and it showed us the second ship of Alexandria from 1798 until Sunday Law. And what happened to the ship at Sunday Law? Shipwreck. At Sunday Law, it was shipwrecked. It gives us a theme in Caesarea. Paul gives a message to Felix and Festus, who is who? The United States, and to Agrippa, who is the Adventist church structure. So the message of Acts 27, what it gives us is the journey of two institutions, the institution of the United States and the institution of Adventism. It gives us their journey in two ways, as a repeat and enlarge. First as one ship of Adramyttium, and second as this second ship of Alexandria from 1798. And what it does is it allows us to compare and contrast the United States and Adventism. When we see the United States as an institution and Adventism as an institution, both rising up in 1798, both going through this terrible experience of 1844, the breaking of the horn, the Great Disappointment, both come to 1863, and what happens to both at 1863? What happens to this ship? 1863, it goes off course. Adventism is scattered. The United States begins this work of uniting church and state. And not stopping there, through the time of the end, through 1989, 9/11, all of those waymarks, we find that there's this close working between these two institutions of the United States and Adventism, and that they both come to a point of shipwreck at Sunday Law. So what Acts 27 gave us was this compare and contrast between United States and Adventism, and it gave us the line of the institutions. It gave us a line where Raphia was midnight, Panium, the midnight cry, and Sunday Law, the close of probation, the shut door, or you could call it shipwreck. It's all the same thing. And it showed us that we have a fifth line. We looked at our four at the beginning of this presentation. We reviewed them yesterday, 144,000 priests, Levites, Nethinims. But there's a fifth line specifically for the institution separate from people. And it's that understanding of a line of an institution that Acts 27 brought to this movement. It showed us how Panium was the midnight cry that gave the warning of Sunday Law as a shipwreck for Adventism and as shipwreck for the United States. As this study developed, Acts 27 verse 37 began to be a bit of a problem. Because the other symbols, it was clear that they had meaning, even if it took time to understand what that meaning was. But when you go to Acts 27:37, which we read just before, it says, we were in all in the ship 260 souls. So there's 276 souls in that ship. And for the other symbols like midnight, like 14th night, you can see the significance of those symbols. But every detail then must have a meaning for us. So what is the meaning of 276? And it was in studying the meaning of the 276, seeing it link to the line of the Levites, the calling of the Levites, that brought the next development of the midnight cry. And that next development was the history of Pyrrhus and the Pyrrhic War. That 273 took us to a line in 273 BC that placed us in the history of Pyrrhus and a war between the king of the north of Italy and the king of the south of Italy. And it's in this study of the Pyrrhic War that a line was developed that showed the history of Pyrrhus from 285 BC to 272 BC as the history of 1989 to Sunday law. And this whole study was all driven from the viewpoint of the king of the south, of Pyrrhus as the king of the south, and what Pyrrhus was doing through his history. This was very much a study on the king of the south. So Acts 27 through the number 273 brought us into the history of the Pyrrhic War, into the history of King Pyrrhus and the war between the north and the south. And we find that typified the history we expect to see in our generation between 1989 and Sunday law. These two studies of Acts 27 and this portion of the Pyrrhic War was all developed in the last months of 2016. That much existed before January of 2017. And it was through that link of the 273. These were presented in Australia in the early months of 2017. Around June 2017, I visited the school in Wales, known as ACE, led by Elder Parminder as the lead teacher. And I arrived a few days before the other students arrived. And that was not planned, but it was a blessed opportunity. I was able to sit down with Elder Parminder and open up what I then understood of Acts 27 and what I then understood of Pyrrhus. Neither study fully developed to where they are today. And in opening up these studies and showing what I had at that point seen in them, gave me an opportunity to show the leadership, and I was encouraged to continue this exploration, particularly of Pyrrhus, to go back into the history of Pyrrhus, back before 285 BC, and see how much this story expanded. A lot of this study reminds me of archaeology. It's like you have something beneath the surface. You might have something beneath the surface and all you see coming up is you might see one corner. And you start dusting and as you dust away, you start to see how far it goes back. And you might get that far. And sometimes you might leave it there. You might think you're done, but you really should keep dusting. You clear off all the surrounding dirt, all the debris, and you're left with what you have dug out of the earth. Say you found an ancient pot. You clear off all the dirt, you dig up that pot, and you have a whole vessel. And what we're doing in history is very much the same. You see this link with 273 BC, and it's just like seeing a little corner of a line, and you don't know how far that line of history is going to go back. So you start exploring and dusting and trying to see how much you can learn, how far back you can go. And through that exploration, in going back prior to 285 BC, I started to recognize that there was a history before then that started to line up with a Cold War. Is it a coincidence that Pyrrhus had a Cold War before 285 BC? And we know that the United States and Russia were in a Cold War before 1989. So you dust further back in your archaeological dig and you find a Cold War in both lines. You dig further back and you find that there's a war that lines up perfectly with the history of World War II. And you start finding these details. So this study into Pyrrhus continued to develop around the middle of 2017. And it developed really into an Alpha and an Omega history. That there was this history prior to 285 BC where Pyrrhus fought in Macedonia. And then this second history where he fought in Italy, this being the 285. It was recognized that there was an Alpha and an Omega. And in application, it was recognized that Macedonia lined up with the history of World War II, and Italy lined up with our history, or what we know as World War III. At this point, around the middle of 2017, it became recognized that we were starting to have a proper prophetic understanding of World War II. Now we were going to be able to start working off a triple application of prophecy. We know that World War I plus World War II must equal World War III. But what this movement did not have was a prophetic understanding of World War I and World War II. This is what begins to open up in the middle of 2017. To give added weight to that link between the history of World War II and our own, a further study was developed that identified a pattern of leadership between the kings of Epirus, the native country of Pyrrhus, and the leadership of Russia. It was recognized that this pattern identified Pyrrhus as being an accurate representation of Vladimir Putin. And it also linked Putin back to Stalin. So this study of the leadership of the King of the South gave another witness, a strong witness, for the lining up of Pyrrhus with Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Putin with the history of Stalin. So it's linking that 273 history of Pyrrhus with our own, but it's also giving us added evidence that the history of World War II must be able to be brought into our own and explain World War III. It was then that what we can do with these histories, if Pyrrhus equals Putin and Vladimir Putin equals Stalin, then these Alpha and Omega histories, you must be able to cut them. If you have an Alpha of the history of Moses, an Omega of the history of Christ, and an Alpha of the history of the Millerites, and an Omega of the history of the 144,000. We don't just take the history of Christ to our own. because the beginning explains the end. God is the same from the beginning to the end, so we also overlay them. It's the exact same prophetic principle with these Alpha and Omega histories, that now with the line upon line of the King of the South, we can cut this line and overlay the four. Alpha, Omega. Alpha, Omega. And in this fashion, we were able to take the history of World War II and make application for our own time. It was around this time, between the ending of the school at ACE, which was around August of 2017, and my attendance at the school, SOTP school in Arkansas, about a month later, 6 weeks later. It was in that time frame, prior to me attending the school in Arkansas, that November 9 became a subject that could not be avoided. So in those final months, around September of 2017, it became harder and harder to avoid the subject of November 9. We're out of time, so I will review that tomorrow when we come back and finish with this presentation. But it was in those final months of 2017 that November 9 already was working its way into the Midnight Cry message in a way that was not planned or intentional, but instead was unavoidable. My mother attended that school in Arkansas with me, and I made a specific request. I asked her to not tell them the date of my birthday, November 9. I did not want them to know that. I did not want them to know the date of my birthday, because before ever attending the school in 2017, I already knew it would be a prophetic waymark that would test this movement. And I did not want my own date of birth to interfere with that message. That attempt at secrecy failed quickly. But I wanted to make the point of that attempt to identify strongly that before that first visit in 2017, November 9 had already worked its way into the Midnight Cry message. It just needed to be developed and understood. We will begin it tomorrow again with a revision. And then I want to complete the steps of this Midnight Cry message. It began in Acts 27 in 2016 at the increase of knowledge. It developed into the Pyrrhic War that same year. The following year, the Pyrrhic War continued to expand until it gave us the history of World War II and the beginning of a triple application of prophecy: World War II plus World War I plus World War II equaling World War III. We were able to cut the line and make that direct application. And then in that same history, November 9 began to work its way into that message. And what we will also begin to discuss in tomorrow's presentation, what began to work its way into the Midnight Cry message, was the history of the counterfeit. We will finish that tomorrow. What I'm wanting out of these presentations, many of you are already familiar with them. Some of you have perhaps not heard of these studies before. I'm hoping that in a brief overview you get the concept that they brought to this movement. And I'm hoping that they give some clarity onto not the work of an individual, but how God has led this movement in this dispensation from 2014, and have confidence in how God has led this movement from 2014. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for bringing us together. Thank you for this camp meeting. Lord, we know many people have travelled far, many are tired, they've had a long day. I pray, Lord, you'll give us all a good night's rest, bringing us together in the morning with clearer minds, Lord, with energy, that we can grasp these things and make the most of our time. I pray you'll bless this camp. May none feel timid to share their questions or thoughts. I pray, Lord, that we will be able to become closer together, more effective as a movement. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.